A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Immediately after feeding the crowd with the 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. Our readings today are very appropriate for what the world is going through. In the Gospel, we have a storm, and the disciples are in the boat, and they are fighting against the wind. They've been out there for quite a while because Jesus is praying on the mountain. He took the time to be alone with his Father because his cousin John the Baptist had been killed, and Jesus had just performed this great miracle of multiplication of the loaves and fish. He needed time to just be with his Father. So he waits until the 4th watch, which would be between 3 and 5 in the morning. So the disciples have been out all night battling the waves. The church fathers saw the boat as representing the church, and the sea, the chaos that can be in the world. So here they are fighting, trying to survive. Now Jesus comes to them. He walks on the water, which is significant because in the Old Testament, the waters represented the chaos, what lurked in the deep. Jesus demonstrates his divinity by treading on the waves. And when he comes to the boat, the disciples are terrified. After all, they're seeing this great sight, and it's usual for fear to be in the midst of a theophany. But Jesus says this marvelous statement, "It is I, do not be afraid." That "it is I" is the great I am of the Old Testament. So he's revealing his divinity in the midst of the storm to his fearful disciples. Marvelous. And Peter is the one that gets out of the boat because he's been the one who has been so near to Jesus in those years of ministry, seeing everything that Jesus does and hearing his teaching, growing in trust. When he recognizes this Jesus, he asks the Lord to command him to get out of the boat, which he does, and he walks on the water. So he himself doesn't just endure the storm, he is, like Jesus, dominating the storm until he gets distracted by the waves and he begins to sink. He cries out and is saved. So a marvelous story for us today. In the midst of the storm, Jesus reveals himself. That's important for us to contemplate. But in the first reading, we also find that God reveals himself not in the storm so much, not in the fire, not in the wind or the earthquake, but in the still small voice. Now we have a different aspect of Jesus' revelation. And Elijah was used to these great theophanies. After all, he called down fire in his great battle with the false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and was victorious. And he was the one, through his prayers, that caused the drought, also caused rain to return. So he was used to God working in these tremendous ways. But God needed to show him he was also in the still small voice. And so now he's running from Queen Jezebel, who is out for revenge. and Queen Jezebel is sending the army to go after our prophet, and he ends up on Mount Horeb, which is the very mountain that Moses experienced God in the great theophany on Mount Sinai, where God comes down and gives him the law with all of this fire and storm and so forth, earthquake. Now Elijah has to learn that God is with him in the still small voice. Now all of that is background to what we want to really discuss today. How do we encounter the Lord? How is God present to us? Either in the storm that we're going through, and it doesn't have to be the pandemic, it could be any life crisis. And how is God with us in the still small voice? How do we discern God's voice? How do we hear? How do we know what God's will is? That's what I want to talk about. Because it's one thing to recognize that God is present in the still small voice and in the storm, but we still have to be able to discern whether it's his voice or another voice or just our own voice. So I'm just going to give you a few pointers. This comes from St. Ignatius of Loyola's work on discernment, but also other sources as well. In the preparation stages for discerning God's will and hearing his voice, the first important thing is to be in relationship with God, just on a daily basis. We get to know who God is. Fortunately, we have the gospel, so we have Jesus, who is second person of the Trinity and flesh, and he shows us the very heart of the Trinity. So we can gain access into that very intimate knowledge of God by quietly reading the scriptures every day and praying over them and having this relationship with God, like Peter and the apostles. And when we do, we just get used to having a sense of God, and bonds are forged, and we are enlightened, so that it's easier for us to recognize the true voice from distractions or false voices. So that's the first general point. Secondly, get rid of sin. It's awfully hard to discern God's voice or his will when we're clouded in sin and when we're burdened. It's hard to see. A good confession in the sacrament or a good act of contrition, just to get ourselves clear so we can see God. That's what we want to get at. If you can notice, we're going through the three stages of the spiritual life. The purgative, which is what I just mentioned, the illuminative, which was that first point, just drenching ourselves in the light of Christ, leading to the unitive, hearing the voice, recognizing the voice, allowing the voice to get into us and unite with our will. And then be open to what God may be saying to us. We have to be open to God speaking a different word than maybe we think we need to hear. Be open to different possibilities and to a different direction would be important. Fourth, be prepared to act. So we're doing our discernment, but we have to recognize that we can't get to absolute certainty unless God gives us a direct revelation. So if we're trying to decide, for example, to take a job and we're discerning and all of a sudden the job opening closes, or we're discerning a vocation or whatever, we cannot be in perpetual discernment. So don't use discernment as an excuse for not deciding. Finally, be humble. Recognize it's God working in us. And if we need to, cry out to God like Peter when he was sinking, Lord, save me, I need to hear from you. And as we pour out our heart to God in that humility, he will speak to our hearts. So those are the general rules preparatory to our trying to hear that still small voice and recognize God in our lives. More specifically, God will never contradict himself. If we think we're hearing a certain direction, make sure it doesn't contradict the scriptures, teachings of the church, the commandments. Because God will never lead you to sin. God will always inspire us to do the good. The lines are getting blurred in our culture between good and evil. And we can rationalize. We can think, well, I'll do this even though it's probably sinful, because it's going to lead me to a greater good. God will never allow that. He'll never lead you in that direction. So, for example, you're doing your taxes, and you're thinking, I need to take the family on a vacation, a good vacation. I'm not going to declare this aspect of income because I need that refund check. It's for a greater good. God will never lead us in that direction. Nor will God allow us to lower the bar. Oftentimes, Catholic teaching is difficult, especially on the ethical question. And we can try to lower the bar and say, I can't do that, I'm going to cut corners. So, for example, a young couple, well, we're going to live together, Father, for a year or two before we decide to get married. Because after all, we're not ready to get married, but it's difficult for us to live apart. That's not hearing God's voice. Another point is the direction that you're looking toward, or you think God is leading, is it going to help you use your spiritual gifts? The very charisms that God has given you, will they be used in this venture that you're discerning for the glory of God and the building up of the kingdom? So you have to know what your charisms are, what God has gifted you for. Or are you discerning something for your own ego or glory? Another specific rule would be, well, how are we feeling during this period of discernment? If we're feeling toward a certain action, spiritual consolations, this consistent pattern of the attraction of the heart, warmth, closeness to God, a sense of peace, that's a good sign. On the contrary, if we're feeling desolation, darkness, heaviness, we should never change a course of action during a real period of desolation. And then finally, seek a spiritual director. It's always good to get others, and especially someone trained, to walk with us. Or if you can't get a spiritual director, a trusted friend who also knows God. Because sometimes friends can see what we don't and can offer good advice. Treasure such a friend who will challenge you, call you out if they feel you're heading down the wrong path. So those are just some of the basic rules of discernment. How do we hear that still small voice? Now, are we to do that through every decision? Or is it just the big decisions? The spiritual writers will say God wants us to be discerning everything. He is in the small details of our life. And how do we know that? Because we look at the life of Jesus. Jesus is always doing and saying only what the Father wants him to do and say, which means he's in obedience to the will of the Father in everything. Why is discernment so hard for us? It is hard. It's hard to sit quietly and not be distracted by all the things. Why doesn't God just tell us? After all, he knows our heart. Why doesn't he just be clear and say, here's what I want you to do? And the answer is, he wants us to go through the process. Because in the process of praying and discerning and purging ourselves from sin, we mature in the faith. We're strengthened in the faith. It's the process that's also important. And that's why God deeply desires that we live a life of discernment. He is in the still small voice. He is in the storm. He will reveal himself to us when we are looking for his voice. And finally, in the gospel, it's all climaxing in that last sentence. And those in the boat, they were worshiping and said to Jesus, truly you are Son of God. That's where we want to be. In the end of the day, the end of our lives, we know, because we've been discerning and God's been acting in the storms, in the still small voice. We worship, truly you are the Son of God. And then God says, come into my kingdom, where there will be joy forever.